In this section, we're going to try using the single global instance approach to implementing the BLoC into the rest of our application. So to get started, I'm going to flip on over to my code editor. I'm going to find my BLoC.dart file, and at the very bottom of the file, I'm going to create a new instance of the BLoC class. So I'll say final BLoC equals BLoC, like so. So now if any other file inside of my application imports this file, it will have access to this single instance of the BLoC. So now that we have created that instance, I'm going to flip back over to my login screen. At the top, I'm going to import the BLoC file, which will give us access to the instance we just created. So I'll say import up1 directory BLoCs BLoC.dart. So now inside this file, we can freely reference that instance that we just created by simply writing out BLoC like so. Well, right here wouldn't quite work. We would want to do it in some method somewhere. So maybe say inside of the build method, we could call BLoC.change email, and we could pass in whatever new email we want to send into that stream. So now anywhere inside this file, we can freely access our BLoC. Okay, so it's great that we have access to it inside of here, but how are we going to actually use it to power the email field and password field? Well, here comes the magic. Here's where Flutter and streams really come together. So let's look at a quick diagram. Okay, so here's our widget hierarchy again. On the left-hand side, here's the instance of the BLoC that we just created and imported. And as you well know, inside that BLoC, we have the email stream. Every time a new value comes across that stream, we are going to assume that it's either an error validation message or an actual new email address. I'm going to zoom in on the bottom here so we can get a better look. Okay, so we're going to go and find where we create our text field that represents the email, and we're going to wrap it with a new widget. This is a widget provided by Flutter called the Stream Builder. The Stream Builder is a very special widget. It takes a stream, so our email stream, and it also takes a method or a function called the builder function. Anytime the Stream Builder sees a new event or a new piece of data from this stream right here, it's going to call that builder function and attempt to essentially re-render itself onto the screen of our mobile device. So the Stream Builder widget is the total magic behind streams in Flutter. All we have to do is hook up a stream to it. Every time there's a new piece of data from that stream, poof, widget updates itself automatically. So wiring this thing up is actually going to be fairly straightforward. Let's flip back over to our code editor. We're going to scroll on down to our email field method, and we're going to wire that one up first with a Stream Builder widget. Now to add the code in for the Stream Builder, I'm going to get a little bit of space up here. We're going to move all of this code in just a second, but I don't want to try to write around it just because that'll get a little bit confusing. So we'll first create the Stream Builder up here, and then we'll kind of copy paste the text field into it. So at the top of this function, I'm going to return a Stream Builder widget. The Stream Builder takes two arguments, or two name parameters. The first is the stream that we want to watch for data. So the stream that you and I care about for the email field, we can access with BLoC.email. Remember, that's what we call the stream that has the string of the email address that the user is typing in. Then as a second name parameter, we're going to provide that builder function. This is a function with a first argument of context and a second argument of something called a snapshot. And we'll talk about what that snapshot is in just a moment. So then inside this function, we're going to create and return a widget. Every time the stream changes, the builder function reruns, you and I return a new widget, and that new widget is displayed on the screen of our device. So now I'm going to take all that code down here for the text field. I'm going to cut all that, and I'm going to move it into the builder function like so. And I'll do just a little bit of code cleanup. Okay, so that's it. Just about. Maybe not quite. So now every single time that we get a new event along the stream, builder reruns, we return a new text field widget. But we still have to make sure that the text field widget gets wired up itself to our BLoC stream. because we need to make sure every time someone changes this text field, we emit a new event on our stream. And remember, the idea there is that we want to make sure, where's our diagram? Oh, come on. Where is it? Here it is. Every time the email text input gets changed, we want to add that new event. And that's why we put together that change email getter. So we're going to wire up the change email getter on the BLoC to the onChange name property on the text input. So on the text field, I'm going to add a new named property of onChange. This thing is going to be a function that gets called with a string that we'll call simply new value. We're then going to take that new value and pass it to BLoC.changeEmail, like so. Now there's actually a little way that we can dramatically simplify this name parameter right here. Notice how we have defined a function that simply takes a value and passes it off directly to the change email function. So rather than having this kind of intermediate function right here, we can instead just pass in BLoC.changeEmail directly to onChanged. So the change email function will be called directly from onChanged rather than you and I having to define this extra function inside of here. So let's try doing that. I'm going to do a little bit of code cleanup here. So I'm going to delete that function. And then to onChanged, I'm going to pass directly in BLoC.changeEmail. And notice how I'm not putting in the parentheses because I'm providing a reference to the function so it can be called at some point in the future. Then the very last thing we have to do inside of here is make sure that if the BLoC email stream ever has an error come across it, which would represent a validation error, we need to somehow add it to the input decoration right here. Remember, the input decoration takes a name parameter of error text, and if it receives a parameter that is some string that is not empty, it will show that error underneath the input. So underneath the label text, still inside of input decoration, I'll add in error text like so. Now, when you click on error text, or when we had it just a moment ago, come on, give it to me. Let me try it again. No, it won't give it to me. Well, what I'm trying to show you here is that we need, there we go. So when we define error text right here, the expectation is that we pass in a string. However, our BLoC right here has the email property. Email is not the string, it is the stream, and that stream is going to eventually emit a string. So we need to somehow get access to whatever value or error comes across our email stream. To get access to that, that's why we have this snapshot property right here. So the snapshot property, if you hover over it, you'll see that it's untyped right now. We can fix that up in just a second. But essentially this snapshot argument right here contains whatever information just came across our stream. So remember what I said just a moment ago. We create the stream builder, we pass it a stream. Every time a new event comes across that stream, the builder function reruns. So whenever the builder function is called, it gets invoked with whatever value came across the stream. That value gets wrapped up inside of this snapshot argument right here. So if we want to, we can very quickly go and look up the documentation for async snapshot. Let's look that up very quickly because it's actually kind of illustrative. So back at my Flutter documentation, I'll look up async snapshot. And then if we scroll down a little bit, you're going to see that it has a couple of different properties assigned to it. So the first property on here is data. If our stream emits a value, like a normal value, then that value will be present on the data property. However, if the stream emits an error, then it will be present on the error object. So you and I care about seeing whenever our stream has an error value come across it, presumably that will be emitted by that transformer we put together. If there's an error, it means that there is a validation message that we need to show on the screen. So to the error text property right here, we want to look at the snapshot, and if the snapshot has an error property on it, that means that there must be a validation error that just occurred, and we want to take that error and assign it to error text. So to error text down here, I will say snapshot.error, like so. Okay, And that's pretty much it. That is our email field. Now let's very quickly do a test, and then we'll take a short break and do a review of all the code we just wrote, because all that stuff we just did is extremely important, and we're going to be doing that stuff like a million times. Okay, so I'm going to do my restart. There's the restart. So now I'm going to select the email address, and I'm going to try to get the validation to fail. So I'm just going to enter in some random email. You'll notice that I'm seeing that error appear here. However, if I put in the @ then the validation message automatically goes away. So every single time that you and I add a new key press on here, that new key press is going to the onChange callback. That adds the new key press or the value of the input into our change email sync, because remember, change email references the sync's add function. The sync forwards that data onto our stream. The stream then sends that data into the transformer. It comes out the other side of the transformer. It is emitted from the stream. The stream builder sees the new data from that stream, and the stream builder calls the builder function again. So that's the entire flow. All right, so let's take a quick pause right here, and we're going to repeat this entire same process another time for our password field as well. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we refactored our email field method to use a stream builder. The stream builder widget is going to be the absolute core of how we update widgets inside of Flutter from here on out. Previously, we were making use of stateful widgets, but now we're going to be making use of stream builder. With the stream builder, we're going to be watching a stream. Anytime the stream has a new value come through it, the builder method is going to rerun. The second argument to the builder method is the snapshot, which contains some information about the event that just came through that stream. So we can then re-render whatever is being shown by our stream builder depending upon the value of that snapshot. So we're going to now move on down to our password field, where we're going to implement a stream builder here as well. Now the stream builder for our password field is going to have just about an identical implementation to the email field that we just put together. So as a little exercise, if you want to, I encourage you to pause the video right now and try implementing the stream builder inside of the password field method. So if you want to, pause now, give it a shot. Okay, so if you're still here, I'm going to assume that you have either given it a shot or you just want to see the solution. So let's go ahead and give this a try. I'm going to first give myself a little bit of space inside of here. Then I'm going to return a new stream builder. This thing is going to have a stream property, and this needs to look at the password stream from our BLoC. So I'll say BLoC.password, which is the output stream from our BLoC. Then the second name property is going to be our builder function, which gets called with a context and a snapshot. So then inside this function, we're going to create our text field and customize the text field depending upon the values that are present inside of our snapshot. So I'm going to find my text field down here. I'm going to highlight it. I'm going to cut it. And I'm going to move it inside the builder method. I'm going to fix a little bit of the indentation. And I'm going to make sure I get a comma after the builder method closing curly brace right here as well. Okay, so now on the text field itself, we need to first make sure that anytime a user types in this thing, we send that new value into our password stream controller's sync. So to do so, I'm going to add on the onChange property. Anytime onChange gets called, we're going to just take that BLoC.changePassword function and pass that thing directly in. Then we're going to make sure that if our snapshot ever contains an error message, we'll show it inside the input decoration as the error text property. So inside the input decoration, I'll add on error text, and the value for error text is going to come from snapshot.error. Like so. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Let's flip back on over to our terminal again. We'll do a quick restart here and just make sure that the password is working as well. All right, so here's the email address. Just as a quick test, I'm going to make sure that still works. So as soon as I hit @, yep, we're good to go. And then on the password, I'll enter in some characters. You'll notice that our password is not 4 characters long, so we immediately see the error message appear. And then as soon as I'm longer than, well, 3 characters in this case, I think that we probably did a mismatch on there on the numbers, but whatever. As soon as we get the appropriate number of characters, the error message goes away because we now have a valid form. So that is a complete example of how we make use of the stream builder along with our BLoC inside of our application. And again, this is all using that more simple, straightforward method of a single global instance. So we're now going to take a pause. We're going to come back to the next section, and we're going to try to refactor everything we just did to instead use a scoped instance. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we finished up an initial implementation of our login form using a single global instance. At present, we have only implemented validation inside of our BLoC, and we've not handled form submittal or anything like that, but we'll take care of that in just a moment. In the meantime, we're going to try refactoring our application to use a scoped instance rather than a single global instance of our BLoC. Now the scoped instance approach, a little bit more complicated, definitely more code for us to write, and a little bit harder to understand. So we're going to take a look at a couple diagrams and then start implementing it inside of our application. So first diagram, here we go. Okay, so we have our widget hierarchy, and you'll notice that I've added in a little bit more complexity down here at the bottom with some arbitrary custom widgets. With our scoped BLoC approach, we're going to pick one widget inside of our hierarchy and create an instance of our BLoC. We're then going to give access to that BLoC to the widget that we choose, and we're going to do so by using something called an inherited widget. So that's this thing over here. So you can kind of imagine that we're going to make an inherited widget, and it's going to sort of wrap one of our widgets. Then inside of the inherited widget, we're going to define or create a new instance of our BLoC, like so. So now this inherited widget has its own individual copy of the BLoC, and it's wrapping our login screen. By doing so, we are giving access to this BLoC to every widget underneath the login screen, including the login screen. So the login screen, the container, the column, the text field, the custom widget 1, 2, and 3 all have access to this BLoC right here. But no widget that is a parent to the login screen or a sibling gets access to that BLoC. So this BLoC only for the login screen, not available anywhere else. The scaffold can't get it, Material app can't get it, the app can't get it, some other screen can't get it, and so on. So that's the idea. This BLoC is only available to this area of our widget tree. If we then wanted to create a second BLoC and make it available to some other area of our widget tree, we would create a second instance of our inherited widget, along with a second instance of our BLoC, and we would then go and wrap some other widget. So now some other screen over here has its own personal copy of the BLoC, and every widget underneath it can reach back up and get access to that BLoC as well. So that's the general idea. Now, some of the complexity in here, or where the confusion or challenge kind of comes from, is in the initial creation of this inherited widget, because it's going to require us to write a little bit of code that is going to look just kind of strange a little bit. So let's take a quick pause here. We're going to come back in this next section, and we'll start implementing our inherited widget, which is going to give access to our login screen to our BLoC. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we spoke about how we're going to create this new inherited widget thing and then make an instance of our BLoC available to just one widget inside of our hierarchy. So let's flip back over to our code editor, and we're going to get started working on this inherited widget. Okay, so back inside of my code editor, I'm going to find my blocks directory, and inside there, I'm going to make a new file called provider.dart. Now the name provider might be a little bit surprising, so let me just give you a quick clarification. When I say that we're going to make an inherited widget, I mean to say that we're going to make a custom widget that it's going to extend from inherited widget. So the thing that you and I, or the actual class that we're going to make to kind of implement this inherited widget, is going to be called the provider, because it's providing an instance of the BLoC to this widget and everything underneath it. So the actual class we're creating will be called the provider, and it's going to extend the inherited widget base class. So inside that provider directory, I'm going to first import package flutter material.dart, as we very commonly do. And I will also import BLoC.dart as well. Then inside of here, I'm going to make a new class called provider, and it's going to extend the inherited widget base class. Now, as soon as we define that, you'll notice that we get this red line right here, and it says missing concrete implementation of update should notify. So anytime we extend inherited widget, we are required to define a method inside of here called update should notify. And we're not going to talk exactly about what update should notify does just yet. We might come back and touch on it a little bit later, but for right now, I just want to kind of satisfy the requirements of the provider. So we're just going to go ahead and implement this function, maybe come back to it a little bit later. So inside of here, I'm going to define a function called update should notify. It's going to have a return type of bool, so I'm just going to mark it as such. It's going to be called with a single argument. Now, we don't really care about this argument. Like I said, I just kind of want to get something on the screen for right now. So to show that we understand that an argument is coming in, but to indicate that we don't really care about it, I'm going to receive that with an underscore, like so, to say, hey, you know what, I don't care about this thing. Now, there's nothing inherently special about an underscore. An underscore is a valid variable inside of Dart. The connotation here, or kind of the understanding to other engineers who look at our code, just means, hey, underscore means I don't care about this argument for this particular function. Then I'm going to put down an arrow function, and I'm always going to return the value true, like so. Okay, so a little bit of just kind of boilerplate here. Might come back to this. I don't know. We'll see what happens. So then besides that, inside of our provider, we're going to also create an instance of a BLoC and assign it to the provider. So I'm going to declare a new variable here. It's going to be called BLoC, and it's going to be an instance of a BLoC, like so. All right, now one more function that we're going to define inside of here. Now this function's going to be kind of nasty. Kind of nasty. Bear with me for just a moment. I'll give you a good explanation of what it's doing. But first, let's write out the code. So please pay special attention on all the typing on this function, because some of the words inside of it are awfully long, very easy to misspell. So I'm going to say static BLoC, and then the function name is of. This thing is going to be called with a context variable. So here's where context starts becoming relevant. Okay, so this is where context starts to fit into all this stuff. And remember, we've been saying, oh yeah, we'll talk about context later. Then inside this function, we'll say return. I'm going to put a set of parentheses in. I'm going to say context dot inherit from widget of exact type. So that's the function name. So we're calling that function. I'm going to pass in provider. And then outside of that first parenthesis, I'm going to say as provider. And then on that entire set of parentheses, so the entire set, I'm going to say at the very end, dot BLoC, like so. Now, just to make sure that you typed out this function name right here correctly, we can annotate the type of this argument right here, of this context. Right now, Dart thinks that it is a dynamic argument. So I'm going to annotate its type as build context, which is what it actually should be. When you add on that build type, it's now marked as being a build context type. And so now we should be able to hover over this thing and hover over inherit from widget of exact type and see this documentation appear. If you see a red line underneath this, it means that you probably have a typo somewhere in there. I encourage you to find your typo inside this very long function name right here and try to fix it up. Okay, so like I said, kind of a crazy function. Let's take a quick pause right here. We're going to come back to the next section and talk about what this is doing for us. So quick pause and I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we created our provider widget, and at the very end, we defined this kind of crazy looking function down here. So in this section, I want to give you a better idea of what's going on with this function. I'm going to first give you a plain English definition of what this thing does for us, and then we'll dive into the actual implementation of the function and try to give you a better idea of what this context thing is. Okay, so first, plain English definition. Now, a couple videos ago, I repeated like 5 times in a row. You probably got tired of me saying it. Yeah, we make this provider thing, or this inherited widget thing. It has its own copy of the block. This block is made available to the login screen and every widget underneath it. And you'll notice in this diagram, I put down some custom widgets down here as well. Now, as you well know by this point, every time we make a new widget, we place it into a separate file. So you can imagine that custom widget 1 is going to be its own Dart file, custom widget 2 is in its own Dart file, custom widget 3 is in its own file. So the scope of login screen right here is completely 100% separate and decoupled from the scope of this widget way down here, custom widget number 3. But we're saying that we need to somehow give access to our block to custom widget number 3. So custom widget 3 down here has to somehow be able to reach back way up this hierarchy and magically, at some point in time, magically reach up and find this inherited widget that has the block assigned to it. So this link right here is what that of function is for. The of function is what allows our custom widget 3 down here, or any widget at some arbitrary depth underneath the login screen, to just magically reach back up and somehow get a handle on the inherited widget and thus the block inside of it. So that's kind of my plain English definition of what it does, without really saying how it does it. Now let's try going a little bit more into how it does it. So the how of this is all based on that context argument that we've been seeing all over the place without really saying anything about what it is. The build context you can think of as being like a handle or an identifier that locates a particular widget inside of the widget hierarchy. So every widget that you and I create, like the login screen, custom widget 1, custom widget 2, custom widget 3, and technically all these other built-in widgets in between, has their own context. And it's kind of this widget's understanding of where it is located inside the overall widget hierarchy. Now, contexts extend down underneath themselves. This is kind of hard to show in diagram format, as you can probably tell by this confusing diagram here. But the idea is that at the top here, our login screen has its own context, which is indicated by the outermost box that you see right here. I'm going to highlight it really quickly just to make sure it's really clear. So the login screen has like this context. Then the container has the next context in. Then the column has the next context down. And then the text field, and race button each have their own separate contexts, like so. A widget can look up any number of levels above itself as far as context goes. So the text field right here is aware of its own context and every context up above it. So you can kind of imagine that there's almost like a linked list of sorts of context, where this context knows about its parent, this one knows about its parent, and the login screen context even knows about its parent. I just did not reflect it on this diagram. So when we see this of function right here that takes a context, this context argument right here will be, for example, maybe our text field context right here. This text context knows about its parent, the green one, and the green one knows about the blue one, and the blue one knows about the yellow one. So this context dot inherit from widget of exact type as provider right here is essentially telling, and notice how we are passing in the provider right there as the argument. It's essentially saying, hey, text field, I want you to look at your context, and I want this thing to look at its parent, and its parent, and its parent, and so on, all the way up the chain until it finds a widget of type provider. So this line of code right here, that little function call says, given a context to look all the way back up the tree and try to find some widget up the tree that is of type provider. This function call is then going to return that widget, but this function does not necessarily know what the type of the widget is that gets returned. So if you hover over it, you'll see that it says like, oh yeah, it's an inherited widget, I don't really know what it is. So you'll notice that right here we say as provider, that's a type coercion. So it's saying, okay, like, you're going to get back some widget, some type of inherited widget. We want you to understand Dart and Flutter, we want you to understand that whatever you get back from this function right here, that is going to be an instance of provider. So the first little segment right here says, look up the tree, find something, and by the way, Dart, whatever you get back, that's going to be a provider, just so you know. And then off of that provider that we retrieve, we are getting the BLoC property. So that right here, the .BLoC, is going to be our BLoC instance that we created on our provider. So let's pull it all together one more time through, because this is a critical little bit of code right here. One more time through. So in any arbitrary component that you and I make, or any widget, we always get access to that thing's context. We're going to take that context, we're going to pass it into this of function right here. The of function is going to take some particular context, and it's going to crawl up this entire tree, the entire hierarchy, until it finds a widget up there that is an instance of provider. We're going to take that thing, we're going to tell Dart, just so you know, this is the type that it is a provider, and then we're going to try to pull the BLoC property off it. I feel like I'm kind of focusing on this as provider thing right here. Just to give you a little bit of clarification, let's try just deleting it. Let's delete it. So when you delete that, you'll notice that now it says, hey, I don't know what a BLoC is. Like, what is this thing? An inherited widget doesn't have a property BLoC. So by putting on that as provider, we're just adding clarification, telling Dart, I want you to assume this is an instance of a provider. And then Dart says, okay, I believe it. This is an instance of a provider, and I believe you that that thing will have a BLoC property. Okay, so a lot of detail there, maybe more than you wanted to hear, but honestly, you're going to see this line of code right here in every single project that ever makes use of this kind of scoped pattern of sorts. So it kind of is a real important little function to understand. So let's take a quick pause right here. We're going to come back to the next section. That is it for the provider. Everything we've done, that's it. So we're going to come back to the next section, and we're going to start to wire our provider up to our application. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we had a long discussion about the of function inside of our provider widget. There's just one last little change, or one last little addition we're going to make to the provider class. You'll recall that up to this point, I've been saying many times, yeah, we're going to take this provider and it's going to wrap a widget. So when I say wrap, I really just mean it's going to show another widget inside of it. To make sure that our provider right here has the ability to accept a child widget that it will show underneath itself, we need to define the provider's constructor function and take some arguments from that constructor function and pass it to the superclass of inherited widget, or the base class of inherited widget. So right underneath our variable declaration, I'm going to define my constructor. This thing is going to be called with two named arguments. I'm going to take a key named argument, which is going to be of type key, like so. And I'm also going to accept a child widget, which we'll refer to as the child. Then we're going to take both those things. We're not going to use them directly inside this provider function. All we're going to do is pass them along to the superclass of inherited widget. So inside of here, I'm going to put the colon down, and I'm going to refer to the superclass constructor. And into there, I'm going to pass the key of key and the child of child. So all we're doing here is taking some constructor arguments that will normally be provided to our provider, and we're just going to forward them through to the superclass constructor. If you and I do not define this constructor right here and pass through these arguments, the arguments do not automatically get forwarded on to the superclass constructor. So we have to kind of physically shepherd these arguments through to the superclass. Otherwise, they do not get automatically passed along. Okay, so I'm going to save, and when I do so, you'll see that we get a little bit of a code jump in there, which is totally fine. Still the same code we had before. So that's it for the provider. Quick pause, come back to the next section, and we're going to start making use of the provider inside of our application. In the last section, we finished up our provider, and we're now ready to add it to our application in place of the current single global instance that we have. All right, so remember, the entire idea of that provider is that we have the ability to select one widget inside of our hierarchy. We're going to sort of wrap it and give access to an individual copy of a BLoC to that widget and everything underneath it. Now, if we just wrapped the login screen we wouldn't really have a lot of complexity here, so to speak. So just to make things a little bit more complicated and give you a better idea of how to use this provider, we're going to wrap a little bit more parent widget here. So we're going to kind of like move this up to around the app or the material app or so. Now, when we do so, we're really still creating a single instance of a block and giving that thing access to the entire application. So it's not that far different than the kind of global approach that we're taking right now. Again, the only reason we're doing this is just to give you a good example of how we have to reach from some child widget like the login screen up our hierarchy to get access to that block. Because if we just put this thing directly in the login screen, it would be really easy and we would not really have to use that of function or anything like that. So rather than creating the provider inside the login screen, we're going to instead make it inside of our app widget, and we're going to wrap our material app with it. So I'm going to get started by changing back over to my code editor, and I'm going to find my app.dart file. Inside of here, I'm going to do an import at the top. We're going to get our up1 directory, or excuse me, not up1 directory, just into our blocks folder, and I'm going to get the provider.dart file. So we've now imported the provider widget into this file, and we're now going to use it to wrap our material app. Inside the build method, I'm going to return a new instance of that provider we just created. This thing is going to have a single argument that we'll refer to as the child, and that's going to take the widget that we're trying to wrap. And so we're going to take just the material app right here. Notice how I'm not highlighting the return keyword or the semicolon. I'm going to cut that all out and then assign it to the child like so. I'm going to get a comma at the end of the material app declaration, and I'll fix the indentation. And then finally, I'm going to remove the return keyword. Okay, so now when we make our provider, think about what happens behind the scenes. When we make our provider, that's going to create a new instance of a block, and now inside of the material app widget and everything rendered inside of it, everything down this tree, everything inside of here can now kind of reach back up and try to get access to the block that was defined inside this provider. So now that we've taken care of that, let's take a quick pause right here. We're going to come back to the next section, and we're going to get access to that block from inside of our login screen widget. In the last section, we added a new instance of our provider to our app widget that's now wrapping our material app. So now the material app and everything underneath it can get access to the block that was created inside this provider. Now, one thing I wanted to remind you about is that we never actually cleaned up our code from our single global instance approach. So really quickly, I'm going to flip over to the block.dart file, which is where we had declared that single instance. Down at the bottom, here's our global instance right here. I'm just going to delete this line. That's all we have to do. So our block file no longer exports an instance of the block, so we don't have a single global instance anymore. Now when we delete that, we get a couple of errors appearing inside of our login screen file, because now our email field and our password field methods are trying to get access to that globally defined block that's no longer in existence. So these methods right here, password field and email field, clearly need to get access to that block somehow. So in order to get access to our block, we're going to make use of that of function that we had defined on our provider. So this is where the of function now comes into play. We know that our login screen, or at least some method inside of it, needs to get access to our block. So inside of our login screen, we're going to add some code to reach back up our context hierarchy, find the closest parent that has an instance of the provider, and pull the block off of it. So to do so, I'm going to scroll up to the top of the file. We already have our import statement for the block inside of here. All we have to do is also add in our import for the provider, provider.dart. So on the provider class, we've got that static method, so that's a class level property. Remember, that means we don't have to create an instance of the provider to access this function. So we're going to call provider.of, and we're going to pass in the context of our login screen's build method. So here's our build method. There's the build context that we care so much about, because that's what's going to give us access kind of up our hierarchy here. Right now we've got the login screen context, and we want to kind of travel up that context and find the nearest provider. So to do so, inside the build method, we're going to write out, let's get it right here. So we're going to say final BLoC is provider.of, and then we're going to pass in this build context that we got provided right here. So now the provider has the static function of, we pass in the context, provider of looks at the hierarchy, finds the nearest instance of a provider, pulls off the BLoC property, and returns it. Then we assign it to this local variable of BLoC right here. So now, the one awkward thing about this, and this is something I want you to be aware of because this is something that will be awkward in many locations. The context is available inside of the build method. So only inside of here can we really very easily use that context to get our reference to the BLoC. But we don't need the BLoC inside the build method. We need the BLoC inside of email field, and we need the BLoC inside of password field. So there's going to be times where you kind of reach up the hierarchy and you grab that BLoC, but you're not going to be able to easily get it over to other parts of your widget that actually need access to it. So in our case, it's kind of easy. What we can do very easily here is just take the BLoC and pass it into the email field method and the password field method. So I can pass it in like so and like so. Now we immediately get an error message here because neither of these functions are configured to accept an argument. So we'll go down to both of them and add the BLoC as a possible argument to them. So on the email field, I'm going to say this thing can optionally be called with an argument of type BLoC. And as soon as I add that in, all those errors go away. Then I'll go down to the password field as well. And also this thing can be called with an argument called BLoC that is going to be of type BLoC. Okay, and that's pretty much it. So we'll do a quick review in just a moment, but first let's test this out inside of our emulator. So I'm going to flip back over. I'll do my hard refresh. Wait for the restart, 8 seconds or so. It'll be quick. There we go. And now I should be able to type inside of here and immediately see that validation message. Great. And as soon as I hit @ the error goes away. And then I can do the same thing. And as soon as this is satisfied, we actually did have the correct message there. It says at least 4 characters. So as soon as we hit 4 characters, boom, we're good to go. All right, so that is it. That is our scoped BLoC in action, our scoped instance BLoC in action. So quick pause right here. I know that we've spent a lot of time talking about this stuff, but again, this is something that I view as being a little bit complicated. So I just want to make sure that if you're unsure about this stuff, you have enough time of me talking, I guess, to really understand what's going on. So quick break, come back to the next section, quick review, and then we'll move on to our next topic. So see you in just a minute. In the last section, we implemented our provider inside of our app, and then we were able to get access to it inside of our login screen widget. In this section, we're going to do a quick review of what we just went through. Now, if you're tired of talking about all this provider stuff, totally fine. Pause the video now, skip on to the next one. Otherwise, skip around, and we'll do a very quick review. So inside of our app widget right here, we created a new instance of the provider. Inside of our provider class, anytime we make a new instance, we instantly get a new copy of the BLoC created. So now, this provider and every child inside of it, everything that gets rendered inside the provider is going to have access to that instance of the BLoC. Then inside the login screen, let's flip out over there very quickly. Inside of our build method, which always gets called with our widget's build context, and remember, the context is kind of like a location or a handle to this widget's place inside of the overall hierarchy. We took our provider and we called the static method on the provider called of. Quick reminder here, because this is marked as a static method, we do not have to create an instance of the provider to call it. We can just say provider.of without making an instance of the provider ahead of time. So we called provider.of, we passed in our context. That of function then took the context and tried to look progressively higher and higher up our build hierarchy until it found a widget of exact type where that type is equal to provider. That returned our provider widget right here, but Dart doesn't really know that that is of type provider per se. It just looked up there and it tried to find something of type provider, but it's going to by default return something that Dart thinks is an inherited widget. So we wrote on here as provider just to clarify or provide some additional instruction to Dart and say, hey, you know what? The thing you get back, it's going to look like an inherited widget, but it's actually an instance of a provider. And so that's what the as provider right here does. It's just helping Dart understand the type of the value that comes back. So then we pulled off the BLoC property of that thing, and that's what gets returned from this overall of function. So back inside of login screen, we had called provider.of, we get the BLoC, we pass it back over, it gets assigned to this BLoC variable right here. We then took that BLoC, passed it into the email field and the password field. Excuse me, methods, not fields. So inside of email field, we retrieved the BLoC. We created a new instance of the stream builder. And we said, hey, stream builder, here's a stream. Every time some new piece of data comes along, we want you to call that builder method again. Try to create a new widget inside there, and then update that widget on the screen of our device. So every time we get a new event coming across our stream of block.email right here, Stream Builder is going to rerun the builder function. It's going to create the new text field. The text field was given the sync add method, which we had set up that getter for, or sort of that alias of sorts that we had called change email. So every time a user types inside the text field, the onChange callback is called, and the new text is provided to the syncs add function. That sends that new value into our BLoC. So back over here, and I'll collapse the sidebar. So that sends the new value into our BLoC, specifically into the change email sync right here. Remember that anytime we create a stream controller, we get both the sync and the stream. Adding values into the sync will forward that value into our stream. So the email stream, which is right here, we take that new value that the user just typed in, we send it to the transformer of validate email. And then the validate email function either allows that new email value to pass through, or alternatively, it adds an error to the stream. So then back inside of our login screen, here's the stream builder. We see that new value of either the updated email or the error value come into our block.email stream right here. The builder defines itself or builds itself again. And if the snapshot, which represents that new piece of data that just came through the stream, has an error property, which was created by our transformer function, the validator, then that error is assigned to the error text field inside of input decoration. And that's it. That's the whole flow. So a lot of work went into this, a lot of work, but I'll be honest with you, I'm super happy that we took some time to get through all this stuff because, man, I'll tell you, this is the hardest part of Flutter, in my opinion, just understanding the flow of information that goes around. And I think that we've got a really great example here. Hopefully you've got a better understanding of how this information is flowing. Now, we're not quite done yet. Although we've added in all this validation stuff, remember we still, let's see, where's our markup? Here we go. So we have the validation on here, but we still need to have the ability to eventually submit this form right here. And we should only be able to submit the form when the user has valid input inside of email and password. So quick pause, come back to the next section, and we're going to start talking about how we're going to implement that submit functionality using streams. So I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we finished up a big review of all the code that we've written so far. So we've now got our two input fields. We can put some text inside them, and we're told whether or not that input is valid or not. We're now going to start to move forward and start to implement some logic around our login button. So the login button is going to be a little bit challenging. We're going to spend this section to tell you exactly why the login button is going to be a little bit hard to put together. So the key thing that I want to remind you about is that if a user enters in invalid input into either of these fields right here, then a user should not be able to submit the form. Right now, our button is always displayed as clickable at any given point in time, and so a user might think that they could put in some invalid input and then freely click on the form or the button right there to submit the form, which is definitely not the case. So we need to somehow have the ability to detect when both of these fields are valid. And when they are both valid, only then should we allow a user to click on the button and submit the form. So let's talk about how we might put this together, first starting by kind of an understanding of how our streams play into the situation. Okay, so confusing diagram right here. Let's walk through this one because we're going to look at a couple diagrams that look exactly like this. So this is a diagram of our email stream. And it is more specifically the email stream when we are trying to enter an email address of like asdf@b.com. So here's asdf@b.com. The diagram is showing the series of events as a user is typing in these letters on their keyboard. So for every time that a user presses on one of the keys, you and I are issuing a new event along our stream by adding in that value to the stream's sync. Now, when a user first adds in ASDF, for every one of those letters, we are passing that value into our stream transformer and trying to validate whether or not that is truly an email address. In every case with those first 4 letters, we do not yet have our @ symbol. So you and I are considering this to be an error value. So rather than calling our add method on the sync, we instead call the add error method on the sync to say, hey, like we see this value, but it's not yet a valid email address. So we're going to call add error to try to get a validation message to show up on the screen. So it's very clear that kind of like at this point in time, right around like 2 seconds, as a user finally starts to press that @ symbol, they are transitioning from a invalid input to a now valid input. As soon as the @ symbol is typed, we're good to go. So right here, at around 2 seconds, if you and I were only considering the email stream, at 2 seconds exactly right here is where you and I would want to enable this login button right here. So in other words, as soon as our stream sees a valid value come across, great, let's allow the user to submit the form. Now our life is more challenging because it's not just the email stream. We have both the email stream and the password stream. So if we also consider the password stream, and let's imagine, here's our password stream. Let's imagine we are entering a value of password into that input. So very similar to the email one, we would enter the characters PASSWORD into our stream character by character. So for the first 3 letters inside of here, we would consider our password input to be in an invalid state. And then only here at like 1.5 seconds, we can imagine that the stream now transitions into the sort of valid state. And again, if we were just considering the password stream by itself, that is the point at which we would want to enable the login button. So again, the big challenge here is that we have 2 separate streams, and we really need to look at both of them to decide whether or not we want to enable the login button. So if we put the 2 streams together, we kind of add it up with a diagram that looks like this right here. So we want to only allow the form to be submitted after both streams have issued an add event and not an add error. So if we had this kind of series of events coming into the email stream and this series coming into the password, then we would want to enable that login button right here. This would be it. This would be the distinct point in time at which we would want to enable that login button. Because by the time we get to this kind of 2 seconds, we've already gotten a valid password. And at about 2 seconds is when we first get our first valid value for the email coming across. So the challenge here with our login button is somehow detecting when we've gotten a valid event from both the email and the password streams. And that's why this is going to be a little bit challenging. So let's take a quick pause right here. We're going to come back to the next section and we'll start looking at a couple of different solutions we could use to kind of detect when we hit this point in time, when we hit the point in time in which the email stream and the password stream have seen a valid value. So quick break and I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we spoke about how we need to somehow inspect both our email stream and a password stream to figure out when to enable that submit button. So in this section, we're going to look at a couple of different solutions that we can use to approach this. All right, so I've put together a little list here. Essentially what you and I need to do is take those 2 streams and merge them together. And then once we see like a successful event on both streams, then we can go ahead and enable that submit button. So I've got a couple of different options on here on how we can approach this. The first thing we might do is take a look at our Dart async library, or more specifically, look at the documentation around our stream class, which we've looked at before. maybe inside of there's some helper function that we can use to somehow join these streams together and get a better idea of when we should enable that button. Now, in between the last section, this one, I went ahead and looked at that documentation, and I'll be honest with you, there are a couple of stream helpers or kind of functions that can help us join together these different streams, but there's not quite anything that's going to cover our particular use case. So although the Dart async library, or the stream class in particular, has a lot of functionality tied to it, I don't think there's really anything inside there that's going to really help us out. So the next solution we might look at is some type of custom solution. Maybe you and I could write a little bit of code inside of our BLoC itself and watch both those streams, and then as soon as we see a positive event or like a successful add event come out of both streams, we can then somehow tell our button to enable itself. Now, I'm sure maybe you can think of a way to write out some code for that. As a quick example, I encourage you, don't write this, so I'll say don't write this. Maybe we could do something like, I don't know, add a function here called submit button, and maybe we could look at our email controller and password controller, and more specifically the stream on each. Maybe we could listen to each of those. And as soon as we see some positive value come across each, maybe we can flip some flag in here of something like, I don't know, email OK equals true, and then password OK equals true. And then maybe as soon as both these variables right here, or these instance variables, get flipped to true, maybe that means, okay, like we're good to go and we can enable that submit button. But, you know, looking at this seems goofy. I hope just glancing at it, you might feel like a red flag or two set off thinking, I'm not sure this is going to work out too well. Essentially, remember, anytime we make use of streams, we want to try to use helper functions as much as possible because they add to the legibility of our code, and they make streams a little bit easier to understand. So as soon as you see some kind of like custom solution like this right here, you start to think, maybe this isn't the best way to go. So I think that the second suggestion that I just threw out there of using a little bit of custom code is also maybe not the best solution. So there is a third solution. I'm going to scroll down to it, hidden on the bottom of the screen here. I think that we should try introducing an additional third-party library into our project. And I think this third-party library is going to help us merge these streams together and be told when our submit button is ready to be enabled. So the third-party library that you and I are going to add into our project to help us out with this task is a library called RxDart. So this is a third-party library. It has a bunch of functions inside of it that allow us to extend the behavior of streams in Dart. And there are functions in there in particular that are going to help us achieve exactly what you and I are trying to do right here. Watch two streams, and as soon as they are both saying, yep, thing's valid, it'll give us some output or some type of signal that says, okay, the submit button is ready to be enabled. So let's take a quick pause right here. We'll come back to the next section and we'll start talking about this RxDart library and get a better sense of how to use it inside of our project.